Hello and welcome to the Auto Limits podcasts, uh, continuing our season where we attempt to gain a fuller understanding of the works of Samuel Fuller. I am ever, as ever, am your host, Craig Ennis, and I'm clearly out of practice podcasting. And with me is my co-host, Robert Beams. Hello, Rob.
Hello, Craig. How are you doing on this chilly Christmas week morn?
I'm good. Christmas is about to start in earnest in our house. My parents are coming over in about 2 hours, 3 hours, and then they're gonna have a cup of tea, and then we're gonna leave them to babysit while we go and watch the new Matrix film.
Lovely.
So yeah, how about you?
Yeah, good. It's we're down the coast at my mother-in-law's house now for Christmas in on the east coast of Spain, and yeah, it's freezing. But every time I complain about how cold it is here, you treat me like I'm a real dandy. So
Yeah,
I'll move
absolutely.
on.
Uh, well, we're here today to talk about Run of the Arrow, which is I should really, this is the one bit of research that I never bothered
What the
doing.
year? 1957.
I was going to be the number of the films. This is the
Oh, this is 10. Number
this is
10.
this is the 10th podcast, but possibly his ninth film. He made this before China Gate, which we
Ah,
spoke about last
yeah,
time. So
yeah.
we're getting into the kind of timey-wimey stuff of it all. Yeah, Run of the Arrow, which is just a oh no, his first film, isn't it? I Shot Jesse James. This is what his second Western that we've seen.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, Baron of Arizona feels quite westerny, doesn't it? The town and everything in it feels a
Yeah,
bit like that.
I thought Baron of
It's
Arizona, but to me that's kind of more Western adjacent than
yeah,
full on Western.
yeah.
Whereas this
It's the
is
sort of film where if it came out today, hipsters would say my favorite western. Well, it's actually Baron of Arizona. It's a western, actually.
yeah, but we are firmly in Western country here
We
for
are.
Run of the Arrow. Um, so just to give you a little bit of a background on this, um, this was this was a project that came about because a previous project that was very that Fuller was very invested in sort of fell apart. So he was looking to make this film called Tiguero, which is a film about a jaguar hunter in the Brazilian rainforests, based on a book. And he went and did a lot of extensive research on this, scouting out the locations, sort of leaning on some of his, well-traveled kind of infantry experience and sort of throwing himself into the jungle more or less alone. And he spent some time with an indigenous people called the Karaja, and kind of lived among them and kind of got to know them and kind of stayed with them for quite an extended period of time and got to know their kind of society and how it all worked and all that kind of stuff, and did all this research, and he wanted to shoot this film on location, and basically the insurance companies nixed it. They were like, no, we are not sending you into the middle of the rainforest to make a film on our time amongst all these different warring, all these different uh, sort of tribes of people who, some of them would be friendly, some of them would not be. Like, there was a lot of stuff, and basically the project got completely nixed. There's actually I didn't know this, but I've just found it out. There's a 1994 documentary about the non-making of this film, where
Oh
Fuller
wow,
takes Jim Jarmusch to the places that he was scouting out.
crazy!
Uh,
That's awesome.
yeah. So what I'm getting
I'm
to, what I'm
I'm
getting to,
really
there's a much more interesting film that we could have talked about that was never made.
I'm really confused about the existence of this non-film because something that's really amazing about the existence of Run of the Arrow is that it's one of 3 films he made that year. I don't know how he also had time to embed himself with a tribe and start and spend all this time trying to research this other movie that didn't
Well,
get
there is a
made.
year out because House of Bamboo was 1955, and this is 3 in
Okay,
1957. So
right.
he's
So he had a few years of building up to
yeah,
all of these.
yeah, basically. So we had plenty of development time, but that never kind of got actually happened. So in the end, some of those themes about people living with indigenous people find their way into Run of the Arrow. So it's, the film kind of feels like it's a compromised version of a different film that he wanted to make to a certain extent. But yeah, I'll leave you to do the plotting and the kind of setup for the film.
I'll keep that very brief. So basically, Run of the Arrow, Rod Steiger plays a Confederate soldier who shoots a Union soldier and doesn't kill him. So he takes the wounded Union soldier to a nearby base to get patched up. And while he's there, General Lee turns up to surrender to General Grant at the end of the Civil War, and it's the most low budget, least attended end of war ceremony you've ever seen, because there's basically 4 people there. There's the wounded soldier, there's Steiger, there's a doctor, and then just like General Lee rides out shot, which is funny. It's like Lee and Grant met on their own, just in a field. But anyway, so the war ends, but Steiger's like a really true, like lost cause kind of Confederate in a way that kind of is slightly anachronistic, because a lot of that sort of celebration of the lost cause and of the Confederacy sort of came further after the Civil War. But anyway, he's this kind of proper lost cause Confederate who he decides, well, I'm not going to live in this Union. Fuck that. I'm going to go out west where I can be free. So he goes to what were then not the United States, and he just decides he's going to go live out west on his own. And he meets a Native American guy who I think is also returning from the Civil War. I think he was working as a scout for the Union, maybe. And he was. They kind of meet each other walking along, and he starts to kind of figure he quite likes kind of Lakota Sioux culture. He just meets this guy, and it's like he just met like a Japanese bloke, and then he decides that he's a samurai.
Well, this reminded me of, because he learns the language in this
like,
kind of.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen The 13th Warrior with Antonio Banderas?
Yeah, it's very similar.
Where they're sitting around this fire, and all these sort of Viking are talking they're talking, and you're not understanding it, and slowly but surely, like, different words start coming into English, and then he speaks up about something, and they go, "How do you know our language?" And he just turns to them and goes, "I listen." And it's like it's one of the cheapest ways of anyway. But yeah, there's an element of that.
So he learns the language really quickly, just chatting to this bloke, and he starts hearing about their culture and their customs, and he's like, "I quite like this. I'd quite like to be a Sioux." But then they get waylaid by a bunch of this Native American fella's tribesmen, who it turns out don't take kindly to the fact he's gone off and worked for the whites, as they call them. So he basically they get tied up by these guys, and Steiger's going to be skinned alive, and the Indian bloke's going to be hanged. And then, but the Native American fella, he pipes up and says that he invokes like the run of the arrow. I have no idea how true to any Native American customs this is. My guess is it is. It's true. Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, because a lot of the things in this are very like white man's understanding of Native American culture, like the idea of the happy hunting grounds and things like that, which are all things that are like, the way they talk about squaws and things. It's all very much that sort of like Hollywood version of Native Americans. So it's interesting. So obviously, there's this run of the arrow, and what that means is one of their captors fires an arrow as far as he can in the distance, and they get to walk off to the arrow. But once they get to the arrow, they have to start running, and the people are going to run after them. So they go on a bit of a run away from the Native American fellas. The old Native American guy drops dead. He already previously mentioned a heart condition. He has a heart attack. And then Steiger manages to kind of collapses into this group of Native American women.
Thank you.
He collapses by this. No worries. He collapses by this group of Native American women, and one of them kind of, I guess, takes an immediate shine to him and kind of hides him, and then takes him to the village where he meets Charles Bronson, who's like the all of the Native American people in this film are white men in red face, apart from when there are groups of people who don't speak, and then they're Native American.
Yeah.
so you get, but everyone else is like just an American actor in red face, and then you get like so he goes to this village. He gets to speak to Charles Bronson, and he says he'd quite like to be a Native American. They take him in, and then what happens is some Union soldiers come out west, as they're inevitably going to do. And basically what happens is one of them is the fella at the beginning of the film, wouldn't you know, who he shot and didn't kill, who turns out to be a right. See you next Tuesday. And you get that kind of typical story arc sort of thing happens where the kind of the commanding officer who comes out, he's quite chill and he's happy to go along with what the Sioux tell him. They say, okay, don't put your fort here, you can put it there, just respect us and we'll all be cool. But then that guy catches an arrow, and then the twat who he saved takes over, and he's like, I don't care about their customs, I don't care about the grounds, and he builds the fort wherever the hell he wants, and that culminates in a big final battle where the Sioux come in and kill a bunch of them. But what happens is that Steiger, the most important thing that happens is that the Steiger character goes from being this kind of anti-union guy who is this kind of lost cause Confederate soldier to then, in the course of scouting for the nice Union man, comes to realize that maybe he has more commonality with them than he realized. And so by the end of the film, when the Union soldiers get driven out by the Sioux, there's this crisis moment for him where it's about kind of, well, what is his country? It kind of questions nationalism and patriotism and identity, because it's like he isn't of the Sioux, but he doesn't think he's of the Union, and he's kind of a man without a country, a man between worlds. He's kind of got to figure it out, and he kind of goes walking off with the wounded soldiers. And then this really fucking bombastic text comes up saying something like, "Only you can." What happens next is up to you, or something. Yeah, which is so weird. It is just what am I supposed
not the first time we've seen that. There's a few of those. I just want to go back to what you said about. Yeah. You mentioned Steiger's character right at the beginning, and I can't remember what you said about him. But you said something as you were introducing the plot. You were talking about
he's a kind of a lost cause Confederate, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's very much. He basically decides the day the war ends that he can't truck with the Union, and he's got to head out west.
That's right. Yeah. You know, I mean, Fuller talks about him quite a lot in the interviews and in his book, and
about the actor or the
no, about the actor and the part. So where is it? Oh, he was sorry. But basically, his opinion of the character is the character is completely unlikable. He is sore loser. He is like hate-filled. Everything he does is hate-filled, and that he's the sort of person that's eventually going to end up, as the nice officer says, putting a hood over his head in the South. Like Fuller's opinion of the McRae character is very, very low. Yeah, and that's, I'm not sure that yeah, basically the amount of contempt that he shows in his writing for the character does not necessarily translate to the screen, I think. But he talks about like the studio wanting Gary Cooper for the role and him not wanting Gary Cooper because he would just be too likable and things like that. Let's have a look. See, I'll try and find the actual. I can't find the actual quote here. But
I think all things being completely neutral, he is an unlikable character. But I think we side so naturally with protagonists in film that if you want to make it clear your protagonist's an asshole, you have to kind of push the boat out a lot further.
There we go. I've got the quote here. So. I wanted the Steiger character in Run of the Arrow to be the basic root of all the hate that exists now in the South. That's why I liked Easy Rider so much. The man with the shotgun is today what Steiger was 100 years ago. The people in the South are afraid of one thing in particular, not just that their way of life might be wrong, but it will be forgotten. The Deep South has contributed absolutely nothing to American history.
Wow, shots fired. It's interesting because what's interesting about that, and I really was interested to hear his quotes about it from your research, is that we've talked before about Fuller kind of both siding a lot of issues and kind of being very like, not even necessarily both siding, because that suggests he's kind of walks the middle ground, which he doesn't. He tends to kind of go in just in different directions. He's not a partisan. He kind of just goes in different directions and makes different stands. But like, this film does feel a little bit like it's kind of walking a very kind of timid middle ground more than a lot of his other ones do.
Yeah,
I don't really feel like it. Like there is that one scene you referred to there where the nice Union general says, or soldier, whatever rank he is, says about how people in the South are putting hoods on their heads and terrorizing families, but there's no mention of race. There's no mention of explicitly racism or the KKK or murdering black people. That's not mentioned, which I wonder, being the early 50s, was a limitation that maybe he couldn't directly address that sort of American racism.
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, because it's always been indirectly addressed in the way that he presents.
It's quite explicit in Steel Helmet. It's really explicit. Like in Steel Helmet, people say, "Hey, look, in America, it's really racist, and you get treated really racistly."
Yeah,
black man. That's the way it's done in Steel Helmet.
No, you're right. You're
Whereas in this film, it's very much like, well, some people terrorize families in the South, and it's like, what are you talking about? Like, talk about it more explicitly, especially if you want to make this Steiger character horrible. Have him be the guy who's like, yeah, I just can't stand me any N-words. He's not, though. He doesn't have any of those ideology. He seems to just be a guy who, like, he's like when you challenge kind of conspiracy theoristy sort of anti-vaxxers and stuff today, a lot of them, if they don't really want to get in the weeds and argue with you, the immediate recourse is to say that they just don't like being told what to do. And that's the ground that the Steiger character takes. He just starts going, I just don't like being told what to do.
Yeah, there is. I think also, that is part of it. He doesn't. I mean, again, it's not. There's a lot of this stuff that doesn't really hit home. That is clearly an intention that it doesn't come across, and that's got to be a failure of direction, really. But I think the point that he says, "I don't know anything about that," or like he turns a blind eye to it all, is another kind of indictment of his character, or at least is intended to be. But you're right. The nice general fella could have. He could easily have more say in his couple of lines there to sort of hit that point home. No, absolutely, I'm with you on that.
I also think, like, I'm a big fan. I said on the last podcast I was looking forward to this one because I really like Rod Steiger, and I've seen him in everything I've seen him in. He can be such a chameleon of an actor, like in almost like a Peter Sellers kind of way, but really intense. And watching him in things like The Pawnbroker, specifically, and lots of the performances I've seen him give, Heat of the Night, lots of things where he plays these quite intense, often quite unlikable characters as well. Not in The Pawnbroker, but definitely like in Heat of the Night and things like that. And I was disappointed here because he's really ropey. Like his like Irish accent is kind of terrible, not good, and also like. It really made me think that the problem in previous, because I've had a consistent problem with these Fuller films where I think the protagonist is a bit rubbish, like the actors, and I've kind of tended to lay that at the feet of these kind of boring B-movie leading men that he's kind of got. And I'm realizing if Rod Steiger's turning in this performance in a Fuller film, he might just not be an actor's director, Well, that goes hand in hand with the fact that
that comes out of some of the production stories as well, that Rod Steiger was a complete arsehole on the set and wouldn't take direction and was fighting Fuller at every step of the way. And, that kind of tension or mismatch, it's going to produce an inconsistent performance, really, especially when editing comes by. And that could well be a failure of Fuller to handle that sort of situation. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, but also, like, I would say maybe he's not an actor's director because what we've seen so far from his films, he doesn't like doing more than one take. and he kind of makes his films very, very quickly. And I can imagine, like, I mean, I think Steiger was like a full-blown like method actor. Like, I think so. So I can imagine that his process, being what it was, probably didn't match with Fuller's dirty, quick way of making films, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, he writes about this being like an early lead for Steiger. You know, it's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's his 9th or 10th film role. You know, he's also worked with
Kazan,
Zinnemann, Kazan, Aldrich, Preminger, Delmar Davis, which I want to talk about in a second. You know, he's got this kind of he's already worked with some of the greats.
Yeah, exactly.
And it could be that maybe he had less respect for Sam Fuller at this point.
I think that's probably true. Yeah.
But yeah, they didn't have. I mean, he talks about still liking Steiger, and like getting on well with him and thinking that he was a nice guy. But they does talk a lot about them in battling. And actually, what you're saying about them doing more than one take, there was a kind of one for him, one for me policy that was going on in the shooting of this.
Okay.
Which again might explain some of the inconsistent acting through the editing. You know, if you're taking takes from the ones for him and one for Steiger, then it might. Do you know what I mean?
I would say as well, just in moderate defense of the film and Steiger, the version of the film I was able to find was one from Russian Facebook. That was not particularly high quality. And
was it in widescreen?
Yeah, it was.
I watched it full frame.
Right.
So I didn't get the full widescreen experience. That'd be interesting to hear your take on that.
Okay, well, it was definitely like Fuller knows how to use CinemaScope, you know, and it looked very handsome in the kind of battle scenes and the scenery sort of aspect. But what was wrong with this kind of stream I was watching from Russian Facebook was that the picture quality was so bad that sometimes making out facial expressions and things was like not super great in terms of detail, and sometimes it looked like Steiger's character had been really poorly dubbed. And I think it's just because I couldn't really see the subtle mouth movements on the character. So I just want to flag that because I don't want to necessarily judge his performance on the basis of what I saw of it either.
It's interesting you say that Rod Steiger was dubbed because Sarah Montiel, who plays his wife, her performance was entirely redubbed by Angie Dickinson.
Yeah, because she's a Spanish actress, isn't she? Sarah Montiel. So yeah.
And Angie Dickinson, who obviously ended up in
China Gate, isn't it?
China Gate, yeah, which was shot afterwards. So you know, he got to, you know, he got quite friendly with Angie Dickinson. Yeah. What else? I was going to say, you know, you're talking about. He does talk about wanting to cast as many real Native Americans as he could, but obviously, you know, that doesn't extend to Charles Bronson and
any speaking role.
Really ripped in this.
He is really ripped. He's pretty shredded. Yeah.
And actually doesn't put in a terrible performance. I thought Charles Bronson. I thought he was. It was weird to see him in this kind of less angry sort of character, very stoic and very kind of you know, he's the leader of the gang. He is. Strange Gary Glitter reference there. I do apologize for that, but it was weird to see him in a not like bloodthirsty in a sort of a bloodthirsty, angry kind of, because I've only ever seen Charles Bronson as the gun happy psycho, really. So, you know, I thought he was quite his screen charisma I thought came across quite well.
Yeah, it's difficult to really rate because he's doing just stoic noble savage, isn't he, basically?
Yeah.
He doesn't really get to do anything. And it is I know. In some respects, it's a really boring critique of a film from the early 50s to say it's a bit racist. But it was my viewing experience of watching it, going like, this film is just full of people like in red face, and really kind of in some ways, I was surprised to hear the Run of the Arrow is like based on a real thing, because so much of the other stuff about Native American culture in it seems to really come from like hand me down, like misunderstanding, kind of like white man's take on Native American culture, and the reason, like,
I mean,
the reason,
I know what you mean, but I would also come to its defense and say, you know, this is an early revisionist Western. You know, Delmar Davies has been making them since about the kind of early 50s. So there's you know, films like Broken Arrow and The Last Wagon, which I don't think I've seen either. But this kind of you know, the kind of the idea of the noble savage was you know, it's outdated and it's racist, but it's
it was progressive for the time, because they were
yeah,
starting
I mean,
to say, oh, by the way, they're not just the guys. Yeah.
It's a step forward from what there was before, which was when they were just savages. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. Adding the nobility was just the next step on the path to think, hey, these are people. I do take that point, and it is. I don't think it's a badly intentioned film, and one of the reasons I asked whether it was maybe a censorship issue or kind of an enforced thing from the studio not mentioning racism overtly, was because I do credit Fuller with kind of having the kind of, for want of a better word, balls to go into that territory. Like, I always think, like, in all of his films, especially when they're the lower budget ones near the start, he's ahead of the game in terms of wanting to have people of different races, ethnicities and stuff in his films, having meaningful characters who are not white people and things like that. And he continues to do that later in his career with things like Crimson Kimono and things like that. So when I see Fuller films that really fall wide of the mark on that, like, for example, the much less diverse crew that we see in a film like Hell or High Water than we see in Steel Helmet, for example, I often think, okay, that's because now he's with the studio and they don't want that. And I kind of feel like it's the case with this, where if this was just Fuller, if this was just what he was doing and it didn't involve a studio, I think he would be much more explicit in the way he talks about things like racism. I think those things get turned down when they're trying to make a film make money for a wider audience. It's certainly in the context of the early 50s. I don't think that a lot of the audience would be too comfortable or happy to have the film sort of talk directly about racism, because racism was much more so the norm in the early 50s for most people in the audience. You know, like, they would still go to like separate schools for their kids and separate water fountains and things for a lot of people in the audience. So I don't know how comfortable the studio would be directly tackling that.
No, I completely agree, and you can see that quite sharply in his One For Me, One For Them kind of period, where he bounces between Fox and something that's a bit more personal. And he seems to be at his best. He seems to be at his best with that sort of thing, really, when he's with it got a lower budget. And I know this is a relatively low budget, but there's still, you know, there's 120 Native American extras in that final battle scene. So I think this film has a reasonable budget, but it seems to all have gone on the ending.
The battle.
Exactly.
It does feel like that, hence saying kind of how the surrender of General Lee feels like a very, very quiet affair. There are a few things. These just I often look at the kind of the IMDb trivia and the Wikipedia page for these films, because I don't do the research you've got. I used to do that on the Kurosawa one. We've swapped.
Yeah, you'll have to do it on the next one,
and I'll do it on the next one. And the trivia that keep coming up for this film, you might have come across it in your reading as well, is that apparently critics praised the scene in the film at the time where they're running from the arrow, doing the run of the arrow. And it shows a lot of that by showing the feet of the men running and not the actual full bodies of the men. And Fuller, that he just did that apparently because Rod Steiger had like sprained his ankle and couldn't run, so they had to just shoot some other actors' feet, which is kind of interesting. And also apparently it was one of the first.
That's how the shark in Jaws.
So,
that's true.
That's
so
true.
you know, That
Yeah,
we
there's
can that limitations breed creativity. So that's
yeah, absolutely. I'm not
incredibly.
criticizing. It's always interesting when that stuff happens, and also apparently, and it's so vague, this piece of trivia, because it just says one of the first, so it's not the first then. But apparently, it was one of the first films to use like blood squibs to show like bullet
Oh, really?
impacts. Yeah, so it's that's interesting. I mean, because I guess if you look at a lot of early 50s westerns and 40s westerns and stuff, they're always very bloodless, aren't they? In terms of people get
Yeah,
shot and there's nothing happens to them; they just fall off their horse or whatever. Whereas
yeah,
this does have, it doesn't quite go to like Sam Peckinpah levels, but this does feel like more in the direction of trying to show kind of more crunchy violence, doesn't it? This.
yeah, definitely. Like the feet on the they make a big deal about people the run of the area, the people having to run barefoot whilst the people running after them get to carry on wearing their shoes. And when the sort of renegade scout falls, there is a shot of his feet all bloodied and bruised from running on this, and it's not as what was the one that was really quite we watched it recently and was really quite violent. Was it? Yeah, there was quite the violence was quite impactful in China Gate, wasn't it? And to a certain degree, Hell and High Water. I mean, those it doesn't quite have that same level of violence, to be honest, except for maybe in the final battle scene, but it is still pretty crunchy.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm
just
expecting from later Fuller, because I've not seen any of his stuff from like the 80s and stuff like that. I'm expecting that when things become a lot more permissible, his films to get a lot more explicit and violent. That's my prediction. I
I've
don't know
not
how
seen a
true
lot
that
of
is.
later Fuller, to be honest. The one that I think we'll get. It'll be really telling to see the Big Red One, I think, which is the one I'm waiting to watch, really.
Yeah.
Which is
But
1980.
White Dog as well. I mean, I'm expecting White Dog to be really explicit in how it deals with a lot of things.
Yeah.
So that'll be interesting.
And the last sort of thing to talk about this film really is like the similarities with Dances with Wolves. When it was, and it says here that when it was entered into the National Film Registry, the sort of accompanying essays that were sort of sent in by film critics basically said the plot's identical to Sam Fuller's film Run of the Arrow. The only difference being Kevin Costner wasn't quite brave enough, I guess, or to play a Confederate soldier. They had to make him Union to make him a bit more palatable for the Oscar voters. But yeah, it's very, very similar. Very, very similar. I think if you took the whatever how long it is, 9 hours of Dances with Wolves and the 18 minutes of this, between that you've probably got a between those you've probably got a more rounded out story. It's interesting you talk about we've talked about unearned love stories in his films.
Yeah.
And the thing with the wife is kind of a bit more kind of on brand for genre, but the unearned love story for me really is his love of the Sioux people and their way of life.
Yeah, you're completely right there. He does that. Just that's what I say. That happens on that walk, doesn't it?
Yeah.
He's just like, oh no, he's just strolling with that other Native American fella, and he's like, yeah, I really like the sound of you guys. Can I join?
And I also want to talk about because I can't remember where I heard this. It's not my joke, but it really rang true with me when somebody said, when I was younger watching films, I often thought that quicksand would be a much bigger problem than it actually is.
I thought that exact same thing, not as funny as that, but when I was watching it, I was thinking like, does quicksand really exist? Because I feel like I see it a lot in movies, but I've
Yeah.
never heard anybody talk about it in the real world ever once. I've never heard a story. There's never been like a news story about a little kid getting like lost in quicksand. That's never happened.
But it does happen in this film, and one of the nice Yankee soldiers saves him by chucking him quite inelegantly, and then falls into the quicksand himself.
I laughed at that
quite
bit.
inelegantly.
I laughed at that bit because the way he just kind of falls in head first, it's very amusing. I also laughed kind of mean-spiritedly in a way that runs against the film. Last night I watched Elia Kazan's East of Eden for the first time. Have you seen it?
No, I don't think so.
There's a bit towards the end of East of Eden where one of the characters, this kind of young man who's supposed to be a nice, clean-cut young man, he kind of, something happens to him where he gets drunk, gets on a train, and his dad sees him off at the window of the train, and he's like, "Get off the train, son!" And the guy just headbutts the window and shatters the glass. He just headbutts the window, and his head goes through the glass. And I found that hilarious. So I've had a good run of these kind of weird slapstick moments in dramatic films over the last couple of days.
Just going to check over my notes and see if there's anything else that I've come up with.
Oh, I've got nothing apart from nitpicking about that there's no sense of time at the beginning. It feels like everything's happened the same day that the Civil War ended, but they keep mentioning things like the death of Lincoln and stuff like that. And you're kind of like, oh, okay, time's passed then. But it doesn't feel like time's passed. It feels like it's literally the next moment of that same day that we're seeing this conversation.
Yeah. I think that's something else that we've come across in these other films. Like, there's not really a good sense of time.
Yeah.
Park Row in particular stands out in my mind. Is all this stuff seems like it happens in 3 days. It's also quite a low-key start as well. I thought it was quite a reasonable start. You know, it kind of sets up. I think it sets up the film that he intended to make. You know, this in a much better way than the rest of the film actually executes on that. But it isn't that the sort of bombastic start that we're used to, I don't think. Especially not as good as the opening 15-20 minutes of China Gate, which was particularly good. But yeah, I don't really have much more to say about it.
I think that's all she wrote on
the other thing is, where do you think? What was interesting to me, though, was that it didn't particularly feel like a typical white savior narrative.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Like, he's not there to sort of. He doesn't join them and then become the best of them and then lead them to salvation or anything. Like, that's not what happens. It isn't that sort of narrative at all. Whereas Dances with Wolves definitely kind of does go down the kind of white savior tropes, doesn't it? As far as I remember from watching it years and years and years ago. So yeah, it doesn't do that for sure. He's never really. It's not like, I don't know, like a Last Samurai or a Dance of Wolves thing where not only they become the best one, but they become like a firm part of the tribe. Like, there's definitely that feeling at the end as well, where he never quite belonged there and he still doesn't have a home and he doesn't really know where he fits in. It doesn't kind of lock it up and say that he's one of them or anything like that.
Yeah. And I quite liked it for that, because when they talk about, again, with the comparisons to Dances with Wolves, like, it doesn't have that narrative that we've come to know and despise from so many other films that runs all the way up to stuff like Avatar as well. But yeah, it was. I will say that I gave it a lower rating on second viewing than I did the first viewing. There was definitely some diminishing returns here, but I would say it's serviceable.
It is serviceable. We'll leave it at that with it.
It's not a difficult watch by any stretch of the imagination.
They never are they? They never are. The Fuller films are all reliably. They're nothing if not short at the very least.
Okay. Well, next time we are still in Western country.
40 guns, isn't it?
With 40 guns. Yeah, we're back into CinemaScope. We've got Barbara Stanwyck in the lead, I think. We've got another,
at least the highest credited sort of biggest name actor. I don't know if she's going to turn out to be the main character. Hopefully, that sounds cool.
And we've got another protagonist called Griff. It's another Griff film.
Nice.
So, yeah, I'm looking forward to this one. I did find this one still up on YouTube in really good 1080 quality.
Nice.
And I saw that it was in scope again. I was looking forward to that, especially having to watch this in 4:3 broadcasting from Boxer Broadcast, which is like this resource for colleges and universities that recorded television recordings, and this was playing on like a BBC Two at midday in 2012 in full screen. So I'm looking forward to seeing that the whole frame again. But yeah, that's
interesting. Yeah, I'm really excited to. I'm not trying to like wish away all the other Fuller films between now and then, but I am very excited, like you, to see Big Red One. I have to say, I'm excited to get there. I'm also very excited to get to Shark.
Shark. Well, that was another thing. The film that he almost made, Tagero, was another film that would have had an exclamation mark at the end of it. So we missed out on that one. But after 40 Guns, we get our second exclamation mark, which is for Boaton, which is a good one.
Excellent.
Yeah. And
also, then you've got coming up some great titles. Like Underworld USA is an amazing title.
Yeah.
Merrill's Marauders is a pretty good title as well.
Shot Corridor and Naked Kiss are a pretty good 1-2 punch.
Good titles,
yeah.
Well, they're good films as well. Yeah, I've seen Shot Corridor. Anyway, we're meandering into the end of this podcast. So thank you very much for listening. We'll be tackling 40 Guns next time as we come to obtain a fuller understanding. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Merry Christmas.